For 20 long years, the land of Israel groaned under the weight of oppression. Imagine it, 2 decades of fear, of hopelessness, of waking each morning to the sound of iron chariots grinding against the earth. They weren't just machines of war, they were symbols of domination, instruments of terror, reminders that God's people had fallen into the grip of their enemies. King Jabin of Canaan ruled from his fortified city, Hazor, but it was his ruthless commander, Sisera, who spread terror across the land. With 900 iron chariots, he seemed invincible. He seemed untouchable. But here's the deeper truth. Israel's chains weren't forged by iron. They were forged by rebellion, by idolatry, by walking away from the God who had once parted seas for them. Their greatest defeat wasn't on the battlefield, it was in their hearts. And as long as they bowed to idols, they would bow to oppressors. Can you feel the weight of that silence? The silence of a nation too afraid to rise, too guilty to cry out, too broken to fight back. And yet, in the midst of the darkness, something begins to stir. Because when God's people finally reach the end of themselves, when the pain of bondage outweighs the comfort of compromise, they remember the one who never abandoned them. Israel cried out, and heaven listened. But the answer didn't come in the form of a sword-wielding king or a legendary warrior. No, God chose someone the world would never expect. A woman, a prophetess, a mother in Israel. Her name was Deborah. Now pause and let that sink in. In a time when women had no voice in the public square, no seat in the courts of power, no place on the battlefield, God placed His word, His wisdom, and His authority on Deborah. She didn't sit on a throne of gold. She sat under a palm tree where the people came to her for counsel, for justice, for hope. And under that tree, history began to change. Deborah's leadership wasn't born out of ambition, it was born out of obedience. She wasn't trying to prove herself, she was simply willing to be used, and that's what made her dangerous to the enemy. Because when God finds a willing vessel, even the iron chariots of Sisera don't stand a chance. But here's where the story grips even tighter. God spoke through Deborah and summoned a man named Barak. He was called to lead 10,000 men into battle against Sisera's army. But Barak hesitated. Fear clouded his heart. And so he made a request that revealed the state of Israel's courage. "I will go, but only if you go with me." Deborah agreed, but her words carried both comfort and prophecy. "I will go with you, but know this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Do you see the pattern yet? In a world where strength was measured by swords and shields, God was rewriting the script. He was about to show Israel and the nations that deliverance doesn't come through human power, but through divine purpose. And what followed was nothing short of miraculous. At Mount Tabor, the armies gathered. Against Sisera's iron chariots, Israel's foot soldiers looked hopelessly outmatched. But Deborah, standing with the fire of heaven in her voice, declared the command, "Go, for today the Lord has given Sisera into your hands." Then the skies opened, a storm unleashed torrents of rain, and the Kishon River swelled with fury. The battlefield turned to mud. The iron chariots, the very symbol of Canaan's dominance, sank, stuck, useless. What Sisera thought was his greatest strength became his downfall. And Israel's ordinary men, empowered by an extraordinary God, swept through the enemy ranks until none remained. But the prophecy wasn't finished. Sisera fled on foot, desperate, humiliated. He stumbled into the tent of a woman named Jael, seeking refuge. She welcomed him, gave him milk, lulled him into sleep, and then drove a tent peg through his temple. The warrior who had terrorized Israel for 20 years fell, not at the hands of a soldier, but by the hand of a woman, just as Deborah had foretold. The victory was complete, and Israel knew this wasn't Deborah's triumph, nor Barak's, nor Jael's. This was the Lord's doing, and for 40 years the land rested in peace. But Deborah's story is not just about ancient battles, it's about the God who uses the unlikely, the God who raises up mothers, leaders, prophets, and ordinary people to stand against impossible odds. It's about how faith, when anchored in obedience, can turn weakness into strength, hesitation into courage, and despair into victory. And here's the question for you. Where in your life are you facing the iron chariots? What feels immovable, untouchable, undefeatable? Deborah's story reminds us, they are no match for the God who fights for his people. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, I want to invite you. If this message is already stirring something in your spirit, don't forget to like this video so more people can hear it. Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what battles you're facing or what part of Deborah's story inspires you most. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because together we're walking through some of the most astonishing hidden treasures in the Bible. So settle in, open your heart. Because what happened under the palm tree of Deborah still echoes into our lives today. There comes a moment when pain finally becomes too heavy to carry, when silence is no longer an option, and when the weight of oppression pushes a people to their knees. That's where Israel found itself. For 20 long years, they lived under the crushing rule of King Jabin of Canaan and his ruthless general, Sisera. Imagine it, iron chariots, 900 of them thundering across the land, leaving nothing but fear in their wake. The Israelites felt powerless. They had once been a free people, rescued out of Egypt by the mighty hand of God, and yet now here they were, trembling under the iron grip of a foreign power. But the truth was, their pain didn't come out of nowhere. It was the harvest of seeds they had planted themselves, turning away from God, chasing idols, bowing to false gods that promised pleasure and security, but only brought chains. And like so many of us today, they didn't see it at first. They thought they could handle life on their own. They thought they could mix a little faith with a little compromise, keep their traditions while also bowing to the world. But compromise always has a price, and for Israel, the price was slavery, despair, and shame. Now here's the thing about suffering, it doesn't just crush us, it presses us. And sometimes that pressure pushes something out of us that comfort never could. Desperation. Israel finally hit that point. They cried out to God, not with polished prayers or well-written speeches, but with the groaning of a people who had nothing left. And here's what I love. God heard them. Isn't that wild? Even after all their betrayal, all their rebellion, all their wandering, the moment they lifted their voices, heaven leaned down. That's the heart of God. He doesn't wait for us to have it all together. He doesn't demand perfection before he shows mercy. He just waits for the cry. And Israel cried. But here's where the story takes a turn no one expected. Because when God chose to answer, he didn't raise up a seasoned warrior. He didn't put a sword in the hand of a mighty king. No, he raised up a woman, Deborah. Now pause and think about that. In a world dominated by men, in a culture where leadership was almost always male, God picked a woman, not just any woman, but a prophetess, someone who could hear his voice clearly, and a judge, someone trusted to guide her people with wisdom and justice. Deborah wasn't hiding in the shadows or waiting for someone to give her permission. She was sitting under her palm tree, day after day, as people came from all over Israel to seek her counsel. They knew she was different. They knew she was chosen. And there's something deeply moving about this. At a time when the men of Israel had grown silent, content to live in fear, God raised up a voice through Deborah. She didn't look like the deliverer they were waiting for, but she was exactly the leader they needed. Because sometimes God chooses the unexpected to remind us that his power doesn't fit into our categories. He uses the unlikely to prove that his strength is greater than our limitations. Deborah stood tall, not with iron chariots, not with military might, but with the authority of God's word burning in her soul. What I find so powerful is that Deborah's leadership wasn't just about breaking stereotypes, it was about restoring courage to a people who had forgotten how to hope. She called them back to God. She reminded them that their story wasn't over. She showed them that when God steps in, no oppressor is too strong, no chariot too heavy, no enemy too terrifying. And maybe that's a word for you and me too. How often do we live like the Israelites, silent, weighed down, defeated? How often do we accept oppression in our own lives, thinking that things will never change? But then God sends a Deborah, a voice, a reminder that He has not abandoned us. And let's be real here. The story of Deborah isn't just about ancient Israel. It's about us. It's about those moments when we've wandered too far, when we've made a mess of things, when the weight of regret feels unbearable. It's about the times we thought we had gone too far for God to listen, too far for Him to care. But this story whispers a different truth. No matter how far we've run, the moment we cry out, He answers. And when He answers, He often does it in ways we don't expect. Through people we might overlook, in places we'd never imagine, with voices we might be tempted to ignore. Deborah was proof that God's power isn't limited by gender, culture, or human expectations. She was living testimony that God can use anyone who is willing to listen, anyone who is willing to obey. And if He could raise up Deborah in a time of national crisis, don't you think He can raise up deliverance for you too? So as we step into this story together, let's not just look back at ancient history. Let's lean in. Let's ask ourselves, where have we grown silent? Where have we accepted defeat? Where do we need to cry out again? Because the God who answered Israel's groaning is the same God who listens to yours. And just maybe, He's already preparing an answer you don't see coming. Barak's story begins in a time when Israel had grown used to living in fear. For 20 long years, Sisera and his 900 iron chariots thundered across the land, and every Israelite child grew up hearing the rumble of wheels before they could even say their first words. When Deborah, the prophetess and judge, sent word for Barak, it wasn't an ordinary summons. It was more like destiny reaching into the shadows of hesitation, pulling a man toward the front lines of history. Imagine it, a quiet day interrupted by the call of a prophetess who carried the very words of God. She looked him in the eyes and declared, "This is what the Lord commands. Take 10,000 men, march to Mount Tabor, and I will deliver Sisera into your hands." This wasn't a polite suggestion. This wasn't just advice. It was a command straight from the throne of heaven. And yet Barak's heart trembled. Barak wasn't a coward, but he was a man who had lived under oppression for too long. Think about it. When you've watched your people crushed again and again, when you've seen iron chariots mowing down your brothers, your faith doesn't rise easily. It's like telling someone who's been drowning to suddenly sprint a marathon. Barak heard Deborah's words, but in his mind he could still see the dust clouds kicked up by Sisera's chariots, the screams of villages burned to ash, the silence of defeat that hung heavy over Israel. And so, instead of standing tall and saying, "Yes, Lord," Barak hesitated. He didn't say no, but he couldn't quite say yes either. Instead, his response was wrapped in insecurity. "If you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I won't." That single sentence revealed the tension in his soul. It's the tension we all feel when we're asked to do something beyond our strength. Maybe you felt it too. Maybe it was stepping into a new job, speaking the truth when your voice shook, or standing up for someone when the cost was high. Deep down, Barak knew God was calling him to lead, but he couldn't imagine walking into the valley of iron without someone at his side who carried divine authority. He wanted Deborah not just as a companion, but as a shield of reassurance. Her presence gave him courage his own heart couldn't muster. Deborah's response was sharp, but not cruel. She said, "I will surely go with you. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." It was both promise and rebuke in one breath. She would go, yes, but Barak's hesitation meant he would not receive the full honor of victory. Another would rise, a woman whose courage would finish what he had feared to begin. Still, Barak accepted, because sometimes even imperfect faith, even a faltering step, is enough for God to use. Picture the scene. Barak, once reluctant, now begins to gather men. 10,000 warriors from Naphtali and Zebulun climb Mount Tabor, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on him. Barak stands before them, not because he is the most fearless, not because he is the strongest, but because God chose him. And standing nearby under the shadow of the mountain is Deborah, steady as ever. She doesn't hold a sword, doesn't strap on armor. Yet her presence is the backbone of this entire mission. Her faith covers Barak's doubts like a cloak. And here's where the story hits us hard. Because how often do we delay obedience, waiting for someone else to hold our hand? How often do we say, "I'll step out, but only if I'm not alone"? Barak's fear makes him human, relatable, and honest. We might wish he shouted a bold yes on the spot, but the truth is, his hesitation is the mirror we don't like to look at. And yet, God didn't abandon him for it. That's the beauty of grace. God met Barak where he was, used him in his weakness, and still wrote him into the story of deliverance. Barak's call is a reminder that God doesn't need perfect heroes. He calls real people with doubts and flaws and asks them to step into battles bigger than themselves. Sometimes, like Barak, we hesitate. Sometimes, like Barak, we lean too heavily on someone else's faith. But God doesn't discard us for trembling. He works through us anyway, shaping our fear into courage, one step at a time. So here's the takeaway. Obedience isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward even when fear is loud. Barak needed Deborah beside him, but by the time this story unfolds, we'll see that God's power was never about iron chariots or human confidence. It was about trust, the kind of trust that can start small, hesitant, shaky, but once it's placed in God's hands, it can change history. And friend, if this story moves you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button. It helps this message reach more people who need encouragement. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt like Barak, hesitant when God asked you to act? And make sure you follow this channel because we're just getting started, and the journey of Deborah and Barak has so much more to reveal. They stood on the edge of war, the air thick with fear and expectation. Deborah had spoken God's word with courage, summoning Barak to rise up and lead his people to confront the terror of Sisera's iron chariots. But Barak's hesitation was plain for everyone to see. He wasn't a coward, not at heart, but he was weighed down by the brutal reputation of Canaan's army, haunted by the stories of crushed villages and screaming families who had suffered under Jabin's cruel hand. He wanted to believe. He wanted to trust. Yet when Deborah declared God's command, Barak found himself faltering, unable to step into that role with confidence. So he said the words that revealed the trembling of his heart. "I'll go, but only if you go with me." It was a raw, vulnerable moment. A man called to lead, asking strength from someone else, clinging to the presence of Deborah as if she were a lifeline. And in that request, we see something deeply human. Haven't we all been there before? When the challenge before us seems too great, when the enemy appears too strong, when our faith feels too small? Barak's hesitation wasn't unique. It was a reflection of the same fear that grips us when life demands more courage than we think we have. But Deborah didn't shame him. She didn't mock him. Instead, she stood steady, her gaze unshaken, her voice unwavering. She agreed to go. She would walk with him into the valley, into the clash of swords and the rumble of chariots. Yet in that moment, she spoke a prophecy that changed everything. She told Barak that the honor of victory, the glory of the triumph, would not belong to him. Instead, God would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. That was shocking. A woman? In a world where men held swords, where men sat on thrones, where men rode into battle, the idea that victory would come through a woman sounded almost impossible. And yet, Deborah's words carried no uncertainty. She wasn't speaking her own opinion. She was declaring God's plan. The battle would be won, but the story of triumph would not be written the way anyone expected. This prophecy cuts deep because it reveals something about how God works. He doesn't play by the rules of human pride. He doesn't hand out victory to the strongest or the loudest. Sometimes he gives it to the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones the world dismisses. That's how he shows his power. That's how he makes it clear that the story belongs to him, not to us. For Barak, this was a blow to his pride, though he may not have admitted it. Every warrior longs for honor. Every commander dreams of his name being remembered in the songs of victory. But Deborah's words stripped that dream away. She was telling him, "You'll fight, you'll march, you'll bleed, but the final credit will go elsewhere. Because this isn't about you, Barak. This is about God, and about a woman he has already chosen to play her part in this story." And here's the beautiful twist. That prophecy wasn't a punishment. It wasn't meant to humiliate Barak. It was a reminder of something greater, that victory is a gift, not a trophy. The outcome belongs to God, and the honor goes where He decides. We live in a world obsessed with recognition, with having our name attached to success, with making sure our effort is seen. But Deborah's prophecy shatters that illusion. It tells us that sometimes we're called to be part of a victory where our names are forgotten, yet God's glory shines brighter. Picture the scene. Deborah under her palm tree, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her voice echoing like thunder in Barak's heart. She's not afraid of the prophecy. She's not rattled by what people might say. She knows her role is not about seeking credit, but about carrying God's word faithfully. And in that, she teaches us something powerful. True leadership is not about claiming the spotlight, but about obeying the one who writes the story. For Barak, the path forward was now clear but heavy. He would march, he would lead, but he knew he would not be remembered as the hero. That required a deep humility, a surrender of ego that most warriors would never accept. And yet, in God's design, it was necessary. Because the victory that was coming was bigger than personal glory. It was a declaration that God delivers His people in ways no one expects. And so a new tension filled the air. The prophecy hung over the camp like a banner. Everyone knew war was coming, but now they also knew that the ending would not be like any other battle. Sisera, the feared commander, the man whose chariots had thundered through Israelite fields, would not fall by the hand of a warrior in shining armor. No, he would be brought down by a woman. That promise carried mystery, wonder, and perhaps even a bit of doubt. Who could it be? How could it happen? But Deborah spoke it as certain truth, and in that certainty lay the seed of Israel's hope. This moment reminds us of a lesson that reaches across time. God uses the unexpected. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the simple to confound the wise. He writes stories that no human strategist could invent. And when His plan unfolds, it's always clear that the victory was His doing, not ours. So the stage was set. Barak would march, Deborah would stand by his side, and somewhere in the shadows of God's plan, a woman was waiting. Waiting for the moment when history would pivot, when a prophecy would come alive, when the mighty Sisera would learn that no iron chariot, no human power can stand against the purposes of the living God. Imagine standing on the slopes of Mount Tabor, the wind sweeping across the ridge, carrying with it the scent of dust, sweat, and anticipation. Below, stretched across the plain, Sisera's army waits, 900 iron chariots gleaming in the sun, the sound of hooves thundering like drums of intimidation. For 20 long years, those chariots had been the nightmare of Israel. They were more than just weapons. They were symbols of fear, reminders of how powerless the people had felt under Canaanite rule. And now, on this day, they stood like an impenetrable wall of steel and terror, daring anyone to challenge them. Against them stood not seasoned warriors, not men armed with advanced weapons, but a ragtag band of 10,000 farmers, shepherds, and ordinary villagers. Their hands were rough from the plow, not the sword. Their hearts had known the weight of oppression more than the thrill of battle. Yet they were here because a woman named Deborah had spoken with the voice of God, and they believed her. Barak was at their head, but you could still sense his unease. He had never asked for this war. He had never imagined leading men into such an impossible fight. His enemy had chariots of iron. He had foot soldiers with little more than courage and borrowed blades. But beside him was Deborah. She wasn't holding a sword. She wasn't wearing armor. She didn't need to. Her presence was the very pulse of divine confidence. She stood there like a living reminder that this wasn't just a human battle. It was God's. And when Deborah lifted her voice and declared, "This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Something shifted. Fear gave way to faith. Hesitation gave way to resolve. The men tightened their grips on their weapons, not because their odds had changed, but because their hearts had. Then it happened. At the appointed moment, the skies above began to churn. Clouds, dark and swollen, rolled in with a suddenness that stole the breath from the soldiers. Thunder cracked across the heavens, and rain, heavy, relentless rain, poured down. What seemed like a small detail of weather was, in truth, the finger of God rewriting the course of the battle. The dry ground beneath Sisera's chariots turned to sludge. The proud wheels that once cut through fields with ease now sank deep into the mud. The iron that had once been their advantage became their prison. Horses panicked, charioteers shouted in desperation. The once unstoppable machines of war were now immobilized, sitting ducks in a storm of divine judgment. Barak's men surged forward. Ordinary men who had never known victory now fought with a fire in their eyes. Every step they took was charged with the knowledge that God was fighting for them. The clash was brutal, steel on flesh, cries echoing through the storm, but the tide was undeniable. The Canaanite army that had once terrified Israel was crumbling. Soldiers fled, their confidence drowned as surely as their chariots in the mire. What had been a battlefield became a testimony to the truth that no weapon, no empire, no iron chariot could stand against the will of the living God. And in the midst of the chaos, Sisera, the mighty commander, the man whose name had struck fear in every Israelite heart, abandoned his chariot. He leapt down, his sandals splashing in the mud, and ran. The great general who once thundered across battlefields now fled on foot, drenched and desperate, searching for safety where none could be found. His army scattered behind him, leaderless, broken, defeated. Up on Mount Tabor, you can almost imagine Deborah watching the scene unfold, her heart steady, her faith unshaken. She hadn't doubted this moment for a second. To her, this wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation that God does not need perfect armies or flawless leaders to accomplish His will. He only needs obedience. He only needs people willing to step forward when called, even if their hands tremble. Because when God fights, the outcome is never in doubt. This battle wasn't just about territory. It wasn't only about breaking free from Canaanite oppression. It was about proving something deeper, something eternal, that God hears the cries of His people, that He responds with power, and that no force of this world, however strong, can silence the purposes of heaven. On that muddy field, Israel learned that faith, even in the hands of the weak, becomes stronger than the most fearsome army. They learned that storms answer to His command, and that He can turn the very strength of the enemy into their downfall. And for us, looking back, it's hard not to feel the weight of that truth pressing into our own lives. How many times do we stare down our own iron chariots, those problems, fears, and obstacles that seem impossible to overcome? How often do we feel like the Israelites, standing under-equipped and outnumbered, wondering how we could ever prevail? And yet the story whispers to us, like Deborah's voice carried across the ridge, "Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" It's a reminder that our limitations are no barrier to His power, that sometimes the storm we dread is the very tool God uses to set us free. So, as the rain fell on Mount Tabor and victory echoed through the valley, a new chapter was written in Israel's history. The chapter where God once again proved His faithfulness, not through kings or conquerors, but through faith, obedience, and the courage to believe when all odds were against them. And that's the story we carry forward, not just of a battle, but of a God who shows up in storms, who turns mud into miracles, and who reminds His people that no matter how dark the valley or how strong the enemy, He always goes before them. The scene is set on the slopes of Mount Tabor, a mountain rising like a sentinel in the northern lands of Israel. The air is heavy, charged with the kind of stillness that makes the skin tingle, as if creation itself knows that history is about to tilt. On one side, Barak stands with 10,000 men. 10,000, an impressive number on paper, but in reality they are farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, These are not seasoned warriors. Their hands are more accustomed to plows than to swords, their backs bent from labor, not battle. Their weapons? Crude, makeshift, nothing compared to the gleaming iron blades of Sisera's army. But what they lack in strength, they carry in faith, faith inspired by the words of Deborah, who stands like a living anchor in the storm of uncertainty. She had declared it. "This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" And somehow, that single promise is enough to keep these ordinary men from scattering. Now picture the other side. Sisera, commander of Canaan's army, watches with confidence. 900 iron chariots gleam in the sun, the most advanced military technology of their day. In Sisera's mind, this isn't even a fair fight. It's an inevitable slaughter. He has the numbers, the weapons, and the terrain advantage. From his vantage point, it looks like crushing Israel will be no harder than stomping on a patch of grass. But what Sisera doesn't know is that he's about to walk straight into a story that belongs not to him, not to his chariots, not even to Barak, but to God. At first, the battle seems impossible. The Israelites stand trembling, staring at the rolling thunder of iron wheels as Sisera's army advances. You can almost feel their doubt. How can wooden spears and weak arms face this kind of force? But Deborah is there, her eyes ablaze, her voice steady. She reminds Barak, and through him, every man on that hill, that this fight isn't theirs alone. It is God's, and when Barak takes that first step down the slope, the 10,000 follow. It's like watching dominoes fall, one act of courage unlocking another. Fear may still rattle inside their chests, but obedience pushes their feet forward. Then, it happens. At God's appointed moment, the sky darkens. What began as a distant rumble suddenly roars overhead. Clouds gather with supernatural speed. Winds howl through the valley. Rain, relentless and pounding, lashes against the earth. Within minutes, the dry ground transforms into a swamp of thick, sucking mud. And just like that, Sisera's great advantage, his mighty chariots, becomes his downfall. Those iron wheels that once symbolized unstoppable power now sink deep into the mire. Horses thrash and panic, soldiers curse as their unstoppable war machines become useless cages of iron stuck in the mud. For the Israelites, the storm is no accident of nature. It is a divine intervention, a reminder that the Creator of heaven and earth can shift the balance of any battle in a heartbeat. Suddenly, the tide turns. The men of Israel, once afraid, now surge with courage. They rush down Mount Tabor with renewed strength, their makeshift weapons glinting in the flashes of lightning. Each crash of thunder feels like God Himself marching with them. What looked like certain defeat becomes an avalanche of victory. Sisera's army is thrown into chaos. Soldiers scatter, slipping in the mud, falling under the very people they had come to crush. The mighty commander himself abandons his chariot, fleeing on foot, desperate, broken, his pride sinking with his iron wheels. What makes this moment so unforgettable isn't just the miraculous storm or the sudden reversal of fortune. It's the way God uses the weak to shame the strong, the unarmed to conquer the heavily armed, the overlooked to overthrow the seemingly unbeatable. The Israelites weren't warriors, but in God's hands, they became a force no army could stop. And Deborah's faith, her ability to see what others couldn't, became the spark that lit the fire of their courage. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a battle, it was a declaration that the God of Israel wasn't bound by human limitations. He didn't need chariots or swords or trained armies. He only needed people willing to trust Him enough to step into the impossible. Deborah believed, Barak obeyed, and the people followed. And because of that, the valley that should have been their grave became their stage of victory. It's a story that resonates far beyond the ancient battlefield. We all know what it feels like to stand at the edge of our own Mount Tabor, staring down something bigger, stronger, scarier than we can handle. Maybe it's an illness, maybe it's a broken relationship, maybe it's fear itself whispering, "You're not enough." And maybe, like Barak's men, we feel underqualified, underprepared, ordinary. But this story reminds us, ordinary is exactly what God uses. Because when the storm breaks and the ground shifts, it won't be our strength that saves us. It'll be His. As the rain fell and the mud swallowed the pride of Sisera's army, the Israelites discovered something that every generation must relearn. Victory doesn't come from chariots. It doesn't come from numbers, strategies, or appearances. Victory comes from the God who commands the wind and rain, the God who fights for those who trust Him. And sometimes it takes the courage of one voice, like Deborah's, to remind us of that truth. So, as the echoes of battle faded in that valley, Israel knew it wasn't just a military win. It was a spiritual awakening, a reminder that no matter how heavy the odds, no matter how terrifying the enemy, when God steps into the story, the outcome is never in question. And Mount Tabor would forever stand as a monument to that truth. When faith meets obedience, heaven itself moves. The storm didn't come with warning sirens or a polite drizzle to ease people into it. It came suddenly, violently, as if the heavens themselves had ripped open. Picture this. The battlefield stretched wide, Israel's men standing nervous but determined on the slopes of Mount Tabor, staring down an enemy that looked untouchable. Sisera's army, with its glittering iron chariots, had always been the hammer that crushed Israel into silence. But today was different. The skies darkened, clouds gathered like armies of their own, and a deafening clap of thunder split the air. Then the rain came, sheets of water pouring so fast it felt like the sky was emptying its oceans onto the earth. The Kishon River, once calm and forgettable, swelled instantly, churning and roaring, swallowing the low ground in a muddy flood. And those mighty iron chariots, the very symbol of Canaanite dominance, the machines Sisera trusted like extensions of his own power, were suddenly useless. Wheels sank, horses panicked, soldiers shouted and stumbled as the ground turned to quicksand beneath their feet. What had always been their strength, the iron, the speed, the advantage of technology, was now their downfall. And Israel's warriors, men with little more than courage in their hands and faith in their hearts, suddenly found themselves with the upper hand. Think about it. This wasn't just weather. This wasn't coincidence. To those who watched in awe that day, it was as if the Creator Himself had stepped onto the battlefield. Every raindrop carried the weight of divine intention. Every clap of thunder felt like God's own war cry echoing across the valley. The Canaanites hadn't been beaten by numbers because Israel didn't have the numbers. They hadn't been beaten by weapons because Israel barely had weapons. They were undone by the one who commanded the storm. The Kishon River surged, sweeping away warriors who thought they were untouchable. Shields and helmets, once polished and gleaming, were now scattered like toys in the floodwaters. The army that had inspired fear for 2 decades was unraveling in minutes, their order collapsing into chaos. And you can almost imagine the shift in Israel's men. These were farmers and shepherds, ordinary men who had probably never stood in formation before. Their hands may have trembled when they first gripped their swords or staffs. But when the storm broke, when they saw Sisera's proud chariots bogged down and his soldiers floundering in the mud, something lit inside them. They realized they weren't fighting alone. God was fighting for them. Every step they took forward was not just human courage, but divine partnership. It must have felt like the fear that had haunted them for years was suddenly shattered, like chains breaking off their backs all at once. They charged, not with hesitation this time, but with the roar of people who knew victory was finally within their grasp. And here's the thing that makes this moment unforgettable. The Canaanites weren't just losing a battle. They were watching their entire narrative collapse. For years, they had relied on their technology, their chariots, their dominance to keep Israel oppressed. It had worked. It had silenced resistance. But in one storm, God flipped the script. What had made them strong was stripped away, and they were exposed as fragile, human, vulnerable. It's almost poetic, how the very river they camped beside became their undoing. The battlefield itself turned against them, like creation was no longer neutral but had taken sides. And that side was Israel's. This wasn't just Israel winning a war. It was a miracle carved into history, a reminder that when God fights, He doesn't play by human rules. He doesn't need superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. He can tilt the ground, flood the rivers, unleash storms, and turn giants into dust. It's the kind of story that makes you rethink every battle in your own life. How often do we stare at impossible odds, convinced that the chariots against us, whether fear, addiction, debt, broken relationships, are too heavy, too powerful, too established to ever be moved? And then, out of nowhere, God intervenes. A storm comes. The ground shifts. What once seemed invincible is suddenly stuck in the mud. That's not luck. That's divine timing. So imagine standing there, watching the Canaanite army dissolve in panic. Imagine the roar of Israel's warriors as they rushed forward, their voices echoing with joy, disbelief, and a newfound confidence. They weren't the underdogs anymore. They were the chosen, the defended, the people backed by heaven itself. The rain plastered their hair, soaked their clothes, but no one cared. They were witnessing a miracle in real time. And Deborah's prophecy was unfolding before their eyes. Barak, who once hesitated, was now leading a victorious charge, carried not by his own courage, but by the unmistakable hand of God. By the time the storm eased and the river calmed, the Canaanite army was no more. Their might had been washed away, their pride drowned in the flood. Israel stood breathless, victorious, stunned by what had just happened, and somewhere in that silence after the storm, they must have realized this wasn't just a battle they won. This was a declaration that God was still with them, still fighting for them, still turning the tide when everything seemed lost. It wasn't just about military triumph. It was about hope being reborn, about faith being proven right in the most spectacular way possible. That's the beauty of this story. It's not about weather patterns or rivers overflowing. It's about a God who sees His people when they're pressed, when they're afraid, when they feel outnumbered and outmatched, and He steps in. Sometimes not early, not when we want, but at the exact moment when the odds are highest and the victory will be undeniable. The battle at the Kishon wasn't just Israel's victory. It was God's signature across history, His way of saying, "I fight for you. I always have. I always will." Sisera, the iron-fisted commander who had terrorized Israel for 20 long years, was on the run. Moments earlier, he had commanded 900 iron chariots, a war machine that seemed untouchable, unstoppable. But now he was just one man, stripped of his pride, panting in the dust, his once thundering army reduced to a broken, muddy memory. The storm that turned his battlefield into a swamp had left him desperate, sprinting across hostile terrain with no soldiers, no chariots, no hope. And as he stumbled into the land of the Kenites, he found himself drawn to the tent of a woman named Jael. Now, in ancient culture, a tent wasn't just a tent, it was sacred ground, especially a woman's tent. To step inside meant safety. Hospitality was a code stronger than law, stronger than politics. And Sisera, beaten down, was counting on that code to protect him. He thought he was clever, thought he'd found a safe haven. Jael was the wife of Heber the Kenite, a man who had peaceful ties with Sisera's king, Jabin. So Sisera believed he was safe. He believed he had outsmarted fate. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that he was walking straight into the very prophecy Deborah had spoken, that the honor of victory would not belong to Barak, but to a woman. And that woman was standing right in front of him. Picture the scene. Sisera staggers into Jael's tent, sweaty, exhausted, his breath shallow. His once proud eyes now dart around like prey being hunted. He begs for water. He begs for rest. Jael, calm and composed, doesn't just give him water. She gives him milk, poured out with the tenderness of a hostess, but also with the quiet calculation of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. Warm milk, comforting, soothing, the kind of thing that makes heavy eyelids fall even heavier. And Sisera, worn down from battle, from running, from losing everything he had built his life upon, sinks into her offer of comfort like a child falling asleep in his mother's arms. But here's where the story turns. As he drifts into slumber, believing himself safe, Jael's mind is racing. She knows what Sisera has done. She knows the blood of Israel cries out against him. She knows that this tyrant has enslaved, oppressed, and broken families. She knows Deborah's prophecy has declared that a woman will deliver the final blow. And she realizes in that chilling, holy moment that she is that woman. Imagine the silence of the tent, the flicker of the oil lamp, the stillness of the desert air outside. Sisera snoring softly, utterly unaware. And Jael steadying her hands, gripping a wooden mallet and a long, sharp tent peg. For most women in that culture, setting up tents was part of daily life. Driving pegs into the hard ground wasn't new to her. It was muscle memory. But tonight, her hands weren't building a home. Tonight, her hands were delivering justice. She kneels beside Sisera, her breath slow, her eyes fixed. She places the peg just above his temple, that fragile place where strength collapses. One deep breath, one steady hand, and with a single, decisive strike, the mallet crashes down. The tent peg drives through bone, through flesh, through the earth beneath him. Sisera, the mighty commander, the terror of Israel, never wakes again. It's raw, it's shocking, it's not the ending anyone saw coming. And yet, it's perfect. The prophecy fulfilled, the oppressor brought low, not by an army, not by a general, not by the strength of iron, but by the quiet courage of a woman with nothing but a tent peg and the conviction that God was on her side. And when Barak finally arrives, chasing Sisera, breathless from pursuit, Jael steps out to meet him. "Come," she says, her voice steady, almost gentle. "I will show you the man you're looking for." And there he lies, sprawled on the ground, the peg through his temple, the nightmare of Israel finally silenced. This is more than just the end of a battle. It's the end of an era of fear. It's the moment when the underdog, the forgotten, the underestimated, rose up to play the part God had written for her all along. Jael, a woman whose name history might have overlooked, became the unexpected heroine of Israel's story. And that's the beauty of this tale. It reminds us that victory doesn't always come from where we expect it. Sometimes it doesn't ride in with a sword, or with 900 chariots, or even with a commander like Barak. Sometimes victory shows up in the hands of someone ordinary, someone underestimated, someone who chooses to act with courage when the moment demands it. Jael's story is messy, yes. It's violent, yes. But it's also breathtakingly powerful. Because it's not just about one woman defeating one man, it's about God showing the world that no oppressor is too strong, no tyrant too mighty, no situation too far gone for him to turn it all upside down. And he doesn't always use the people we expect. Sometimes he uses the Jaels of the world, those hidden figures who are brave enough to step into destiny when it comes knocking at their door. And so, in the quiet of that tent, with a storm of history raging around her, Jael forever changed the story of her people. Sisera's reign of terror was over. Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled. And Israel, at long last, was free. When the dust of battle finally settled on that blood-soaked valley, when the storm clouds that God himself had stirred began to drift away, Israel stood stunned in the glow of a victory they never could have won on their own. The iron chariots of Sisera, once the terror of the land, lay stuck and broken in the mud. The mighty general himself was gone, struck down not by a soldier, not by a blade, but by the hand of an unlikely woman in the quiet of a tent. And as the people caught their breath, realizing the nightmare of oppression was finally over, a new sound rose. Not the clash of swords, not the screams of battle, but the clear, powerful voice of Deborah, the prophetess, the judge, the leader who had dared to believe God when no one else would. She did not lift her sword that day, she lifted her voice. And what came out of her heart was not just a song, but a testimony that still echoes across the centuries. Her song, recorded in Judges chapter 5, is one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Bible, and it is raw, unpolished, and real. It isn't the kind of polished anthem you'd expect to hear at a coronation or a military parade. It's more like a freedom song, the kind of melody that rises out of survivors who've seen the impossible and lived to tell about it. Imagine a nation that had been crushed for 20 years under cruel oppression suddenly realizing that they were free. That's what her voice carried, a mix of gratitude, awe, and holy fire. She begins not by praising the warriors, not by praising herself, but by lifting up God. She declares that it was the Lord who marched out, the Lord who shook the earth, the Lord who made the mountains tremble. From the very first line, Deborah makes it clear. This victory wasn't about human strength, it was about divine intervention. But then, her words take on a very human tone. She recounts how Israel had fallen into despair, how village life had stopped, how highways had been abandoned out of fear. For 2 decades, they lived in hiding, beaten down, feeling helpless. And then she says this stunning line, "Until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel." Notice, she doesn't call herself a warrior, a queen, or a general. She calls herself a mother. And that detail changes everything. Because motherhood isn't about wielding power, it's about giving life, about nurturing, about refusing to let your children be destroyed. Deborah stepped into her calling, not out of ambition, but out of love for her people. And in that love, she became dangerous to the enemy. The song also takes time to honor Jael, the woman who struck down Sisera in her tent. Deborah spares no words. She calls Jael most blessed among women. It's shocking, really, because Jael wasn't part of Israel's army. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't anyone's first guess for heroism. Yet, in that decisive moment, she chose courage over fear, action over silence, and Deborah makes sure the nation never forgets her. The song paints the scene with vivid irony. While Sisera's mother peers anxiously out the window, wondering why her son's chariot is delayed, the truth is that he is lying dead with a tent peg through his temple. It's both tragic and triumphant, a reminder that God can turn the proudest enemies into dust and lift up the most unlikely people as his instruments of justice. But Deborah's song doesn't stop at celebration. She uses it as a mirror, calling out those tribes of Israel who chose to stay home instead of joining the fight. She names them, the tribe of Reuben, stuck in endless debate, the people of Gilead and Dan, lingering in their ships, Asher sitting by the seashore. Her words are a rebuke, a sting in the conscience of those who watched history unfold but were too afraid or too comfortable to be part of it. And in that moment, her song becomes more than a victory chant. It becomes a prophetic warning for every generation. Don't miss the chance to stand with God when he moves. Listening to her words, you can almost feel the energy of the people, their hearts swelling as they hear their story put into song. Songs have a way of making victories last longer than the moment itself. Battles end, but songs carry the memory forward. And Deborah's song wasn't just about remembering, it was about shaping the future. It declared that God fights for his people, that faith can overturn the strongest armies, that women can rise as leaders when men hesitate, and that courage always leaves a legacy. For Israel, that song became more than music. It was a national memory, a testimony carved into their identity. Every time it was sung, children would learn that freedom came not from chariots and swords, but from trusting the God who controls the storm. Every time it was sung, women would remember that their voices and their courage mattered. Every time it was sung, tribes would be reminded not to sit back when God calls his people to rise. And maybe that's why, even thousands of years later, Deborah's song still speaks. It tells us that leadership doesn't always look like what we expect. It reminds us that ordinary people, mothers, villagers, farmers, can rise up and change history when they put their trust in God. It warns us that neutrality in times of struggle is not safety, it's compromise. And above all, it celebrates a God who steps into the mud, into the chaos, into the impossible, and wins the victory for his people. So picture it, Deborah standing tall, her voice ringing over the battlefield, her people gathered in awe, their hearts finally free. It wasn't just a song, it was the heartbeat of a nation reborn. For 40 years after Deborah's victory, Israel knew peace. Think about that for a moment. 40 years, that's an entire generation. Children grew up without the sound of war drums in the background. Families planted vineyards and harvested grain without scanning the horizon for enemy chariots. The cries of fear were replaced by songs of joy, and at the center of this piece was the memory of one woman who dared to believe that God could use her, a prophetess, a mother in Israel, to do what no warrior or king had the courage to attempt. Deborah's life became a living reminder that God's power isn't bound by what we consider strength. It doesn't depend on iron chariots or well-trained armies. It flows through faith, obedience, and a willingness to say yes, even when fear is screaming no. And honestly, that's the part of the story that speaks the loudest to us today. Because let's be real, most of us don't feel like warriors. We don't wake up in the morning thinking we're ready to charge into battle. We're just ordinary people trying to raise families, pay bills, keep faith alive in a world that often feels like it's tearing itself apart. And yet, Deborah's story shows us that ordinary is exactly what God looks for. He delights in using the unexpected, the overlooked, the humble, the underestimated. Deborah wasn't a military commander. Jael wasn't a soldier. Barak himself hesitated when he first heard the call, and yet, together, they became the instruments of God's deliverance. There's something profoundly American about that truth. We love underdog stories. From the revolution to everyday tales of people rising against impossible odds, our culture is filled with moments where the unlikely become heroes. And Deborah's story fits right in. It reminds us that leadership doesn't always look like crowns or titles. Sometimes it looks like a woman under a palm tree, listening to God's voice when nobody else will. Sometimes it looks like someone taking a single step of obedience, even when fear whispers that it won't make a difference. But here's the challenge. Are we willing to step into that kind of story ourselves? Because it's easy to watch Deborah from a distance and cheer her on. It's harder to look at our own lives and realize that God may be asking us to rise up in ways that make us uncomfortable. Maybe He's nudging you to speak up for someone who doesn't have a voice. Maybe He's calling you to take a leap of faith that scares you half to death. Maybe He's whispering that it's time to put down excuses and trust that He can use you right where you are. Deborah's legacy isn't just about what happened thousands of years ago. It's about what can happen today when faith collides with obedience. She wasn't special because of her position. She was special because she trusted that God was bigger than her weakness. And that, more than anything, is the invitation her story leaves with us. Will we choose fear, or will we choose faith? Will we keep waiting for someone else to rise up, or will we recognize that God may be asking us to step forward? And I'll be honest, it won't always be easy. Faith rarely is. Sometimes saying yes to God feels like stepping onto a battlefield with nothing but a prayer in your hand. But history has proven over and over again that when people step out in obedience, even trembling obedience, God shows up in ways that no one can deny. Deborah knew it, Barak discovered it, Jael proved it. And Israel lived in the blessing of it for 40 years. So maybe that's the takeaway for us. Peace doesn't just happen. Victory doesn't just appear. It comes when ordinary people say yes to an extraordinary God. And maybe you're sitting there wondering if your yes really matters. Let me tell you, it does. It always does. Because you never know what ripple your obedience might create. You never know whose life might be changed because you trusted God in a moment when everything inside you wanted to play it safe. That's why Deborah's story is more than history. It's a mirror reflecting back the question we can't avoid. What will we do with the time we've been given? She called herself a mother in Israel, not a warrior, not a queen, not a conqueror. And yet, her faith outlived iron chariots. Her obedience shook nations, and her courage still speaks across centuries to remind us that when the world trembles in fear, God is searching for those who will rise in faith. And here's where I want to bring it home. If Deborah's story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Take it with you. Let it shape the way you face challenges this week. Let it remind you that fear doesn't get the final word. Faith does. And if this journey through her story gave you encouragement, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share what part of Deborah's story hit you the hardest. Was it her courage? Was it Jael's boldness? Was it the miracle on the battlefield? Your perspective might be the exact encouragement someone else needs to hear. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. There are so many more hidden treasures in Scripture that will inspire, challenge, and maybe even surprise you. Deborah's story ends with 40 years of peace. My hope is that her legacy leaves you with a peace that comes from knowing God can use anyone, yes, even you, to make a difference. Because history isn't only written in palaces and battlefields. Sometimes it's written in the quiet faith of someone who simply said yes.